Good afternoon and welcome to Facebook Live with Chisholm, and Kilpatrick. My name is Emma Peterson and I'm joined today by Courtney Ross and Michelle DeTore. And we're going to be talking with you a little bit about depression, service connection for depression, symptoms of depression, and pretty much everything you need to know and sort of a basic understanding of how this disability works in the VA disability system. As always, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section and we will try to get to them as best as possible. A lot of the information we're talking about today is available on our website at cck-law.com in our blog section, so please be sure to look on that section of the website if you've got further questions. All right, so with that, we're just going to dive right in. So Courtney, what are some common symptoms of depression?
Sure. So obviously the symptoms for each individual could vary, but generally speaking, some of the more common symptoms are persistent feelings of sadness, of worthlessness, feelings of guilt, a lack of motivation or interest in activities that you may have previously enjoyed, maybe difficulty sleeping or difficulty concentrating, a lack of appetite, resulting in a change in a person's weight. There can also be other physical manifestations, so for example, digestive or stomach problems due to the feeling depressed. So those are just examples of some of the common symptoms. Again, it will vary for each individual.
So it's a broad range. It's the typical things you think of, but maybe also some physical things too.
Yes.
Pain, GI issues, things like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. All right, so Michelle, how do we show direct service connection for depression?
Sure. So direct service connection has three elements. So the first element is that you need to have a current disability. The second element is that there needs to have been a in-service event or injury. And the third element is that you need a medical nexus. So basically a medical opinion linking your current diagnosis to the in-service event or injury.
So what are some in-service causes of depression? Because I know people might think of more like injuries causing, physical injury. What might cause depression?
So it could be anything from your military service. So there could have been an event in your military service, such as, things can happen while you're in service, but you could also have things that are not service related. So, you could maybe have a death in the family that was very traumatic and it happened while you were in service. And at that point in time, you started experiencing depression. There could be incidents, like I said earlier, or events in service that cause the depression. But I think that a lot of times people associate the fact that depression has to be directly related to your military service. But in reality, it just had to begin during your military service.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be a military related depression. It can be anything in your life as long as you were on active duty at that time.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, and what about, that really covers sort of direct service connection, something happens, you have a nexus, you have a diagnosis. What about secondary service connection, Courtney?
Yeah, so secondary service connection is a different type of way to get service connected. And the way it usually works is a veteran has a condition that has already been service connected for by VA, so they're already receiving benefits for it. And the depression has resulted from that already service connected condition. So just to give you an example to provide a little bit of context, one of the more common secondary service connection is where a veteran might have an orthopedic condition, maybe a back condition, and it's really severe and it has impacted the veteran's daily life and what they're able to do. And the result is that it's started to cause them to feel depressed and develop that depression diagnosis.
Okay. Now, there are other conditions that can result from depression, right? So for example, a lot of the psychotropic medications might cause weight gain and lead to maybe orthopedic conditions or aggravate orthopedic conditions. So it really can work both ways in that something might happen to you in service to cause an injury and you become depressed, and then also the depression itself might lead to other conditions. So it can go both ways.
Exactly, yep. Or the depression might develop from a condition that has already been established.
Correct. Okay, great. What if for veterans who suffered from depression prior to service?
Yeah, so you could still get service connected for the depression even if it existed prior to service if your military service aggravated that condition. And you would need to establish that to VA that even though it existed prior to it, your military experience worsened the condition.
Okay. Now, we talked a little bit, or Michelle talked a little bit about needing a medical nexus. Yep. So oftentimes VA will schedule you for a C&P examination. So how does that work for depression, Michelle?
Sure. So a lot of times in the processing of your VA claims, VA will go out and schedule you for an examination. It could be, through a private facility or through a VA medical center. And what you'll do is you'll go to a VA examination and you'll talk to typically a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and they'll go through the symptoms of your disability and, whether it's an increased rating examination or a service connection examination, they'll discuss why that condition is related to service or, like Courtney said, related to a service-connected disability, or they'll go through exactly, the severity of the condition, and they do that for both types of examinations. And then at the end, the examiner will compile their findings and submit that to the Department of Veterans Affairs. It is something that veterans are able to get a copy of. One thing I will say just to be mindful of is it does sometimes take a few weeks for the examiner to finish their findings and get that submitted. So sometimes it's not readily available. However, other times it is pretty readily available, I would say, within the week. But if you do have representatives that are working on your case, whether it's a veteran service organization or a private attorney or practitioner, through access to VA's electronic systems, specifically VVMS, you're able to quickly get that examination and download it from there so that you can review it.
Okay, so I think the takeaway there is that they're not going to give it to you at the end of the exam, a copy. You're going to have to request it if you want to see it. And it might take a little bit of time to get it, and you should certainly reach out to a VSO, like our colleagues at DAV, your accredited rep, or whoever you're working with on your claim. Or if you're working with your claim by yourself, that's absolutely fine. Go down to the RO, ask them for a copy. Make someone help you get this, because you absolutely have a right to see it.
You can also go to the VA Medical Center. There's a release that you fill out. It's a 5345, and once you submit that to them, they should be able to give it to you. Okay,
that's great. And they can get that form online, right?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So it's VA form probably 21.
It's 21-5345, and you just go to va.gov/the forms page.
Cool. Great. Now, what can a veteran do if they receive an unfavorable VA exam, Courtney?
Yeah, so a veteran could submit evidence or argument to counter that unfavorable examination. So a few examples of specific things you could do is consider getting your own private medical opinion to assess your depression and see if that private doctor can provide a nexus to your time in service or, again, to a condition that's already service-connected. You could also submit lay testimony that outlines the onset of your psychiatric symptoms in service or and how your symptoms have progressed since you left service. And you could also consider submitting an argument in another lay statement if you don't feel like that exam accurately captures your experience with that examiner. So if you think it's inadequate in terms of what you reported to the examiner is not being correctly documented on that examination.
So it sounds like there's sort of three general types of evidence you could submit. Medical evidence about your depression, lay evidence about what you experienced and when you experienced it, and then some lay arguments or just argument against maybe some negative evidence in your case.
Yes.
Now, how can a veteran submit evidence with an appeal under VA's new system, under the AMA?
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of content about this, so please, please, please go to our website and check it out. But how can veterans do that in this new system?
Yeah, so it's very different under the new system in terms of the rules for when you can submit evidence. And it all depends on which review option you select when you get a decision. So when a veteran gets an initial decision, they have 3 different options now to select. They can choose a higher level review of the decision, they can choose to file a supplemental claim, or they can choose to file an NOD directly to the board, which gives them, again, 3 separate docket options. If you choose higher level review, you cannot submit any additional evidence, only argument. If you choose to file a supplemental claim, you can submit additional evidence, but it needs to be what's called new and relevant evidence. And if you choose to file an NOD to the board, again, the rules for if you can submit evidence will depend on which docket you select for the board. So if you choose the direct docket, it's similar to higher level review in that you cannot submit any additional evidence, only argument. If you choose the evidence docket, you will have 90 days from the date that you file the NOD to submit additional evidence. Or if you select the third docket, which is the hearing docket, you're allowed to submit evidence at the time of the hearing or within 90 days after the hearing.
Okay, so if you caught all that, that's great. But again, I really strongly encourage you, I think we all 3 would, to go to our website, check out what we have on the AMA and the different lanes and dockets you can pick.
Yes.
Talk with whoever you work on your case with about which lane or docket to select,
Yes.
because you want to be sure that you're picking a lane or docket that you can add evidence if that's something you need to do.
Yeah.
And that also is important not only for service connection cases, but also increased rating cases.
Absolutely.
So what kinds of evidence do veterans need to show an increased rating for if they've already been service connected for depression?
Sure, like the evidence we were just talking about, you can use medical evidence, lay evidence. Basically, you need to show that your condition increased in severity or that the original rating was incorrect. And you can do it by just submitting medical evidence, lay evidence, or any type of argument maybe against the evidence that is of record showing that that evidence supported a higher rating than what you currently have.
And VA has diagnostic codes for every condition pretty much under the sun, almost all of them. Not all of them, but almost.
Yep.
And there are a couple DCs or diagnostic codes that relate to depression. But I think the thing to know is that all the mental health conditions have the same criteria.
Yes.
So they've got, a couple DCs, 9433, 9434, and so on. But the rating criteria is the same whether you have depression, PTSD, anxiety.
Yes.
It's the same type of factors. So how does VA rate depression?
Sure. So generally speaking, the rating criteria for mental disorders, which as Emma just said, would be what VA uses to rate depression. It's looking at the occupational and social impairment that's caused by your depression, and your specific symptoms and how they result in that occupational and social impairment. For each criteria, so a veteran, let me back up and say that a veteran can be rated at 0%, 10%, 30%, 50, 70, or 100. So that's the way the rating criteria is set up. And for each one of those ratings, there is a list of symptoms and impairments that VA will consider to decide which rating they think the veteran fits in. It's not an exhaustive list, so veterans might have symptoms that fit in with the 50% and others that seem to be more applicable to the 70% rating. And they might have symptoms resulting from the depression that aren't listed at all in that rating criteria. And VA still needs to be considering those other symptoms as well in terms of how they affect the social and occupational impairment.
Do you need to hit every criteria, most of the criteria to get the rating, none of the criteria? How does that work?
So there is a definitely misconception that you have to have all the symptoms listed in each rating criteria for each percentage. However, that's incorrect. You have to just show they're examples. So they're saying that, these are some examples of what would meet a 70% or a 50%. And you don't need to have all of them. Ideally, you should be falling within some of them. But as long as you're showing that, the occupational and social impairment that you're experiencing falls under what they consider to be at that level, I think that that's usually enough to get you to your increased ratings.
And it's a little different than maybe like an orthopedic rating, which relies on, a very mechanical range of motion, hearing loss. It has set levels. Like Courtney said, and like Michelle said, the diagnostic criteria for mental health conditions are examples. So it really goes from, no social and occupational impairment up to total social and occupational impairment. Because every person's unique in how their mental health condition manifests.
Exactly.
So you certainly can get creative with your arguments and lay statements. Now, a lot of times people are diagnosed with more than one mental health condition at a time. So Michelle, are they going to get 2 ratings for that? How's that going to work?
So as we discussed earlier, all mental health conditions are under the same criteria. So unfortunately, there's usually no way to parse out the symptoms. So they're almost always just rated and combined together. However, sometimes VA can parse out the symptoms. Maybe your anxiety is one thing, but your PTSD is another thing, and they can separate them, and medical opinions are there. It's very uncommon that they're able to do it, but typically they'll take the 2 diagnostic codes, they'll give you one condition, they'll say you have PTSD with anxiety, depression, and it's rated at 70% because they can't separate the symptoms that you have from your PTSD, your anxiety, and your depression.
But you're not going to get a 30 for PTSD and a 30 for depression. You're just going to get one rating of all those symptoms as if it was one condition.
Yep.
But they'll list out the different diagnoses that you might have.
Yep.
Okay. And I think that's important to note because sometimes we come across clients that want to file claims for, they have anxiety and they want to file for PTSD or vice versa. So certainly talk with your representative about whether or not that's a good idea. If VA is underrating you because they're not considering some symptoms because they say it's due to a non-service connected psychiatric disability, it might be worth it. But if they're considering everything you have, it might not be worth it because you're not going to get an additional rating
Yeah.
by filing for service connection.
And sometimes it does, sometimes they're not considering it because it's part of another condition, but sometimes you have the opposite effect where VA is considering it and saying that it's part of that condition. But if you go and file for PTSD when you're service connected for anxiety, they might say, well, now you're saying these symptoms are due to a non-service connected condition and we're going to reduce or lower your rating.
Yep.
So it's just something to be mindful of when you are filing for multiple diagnoses.
Okay. So what if a veteran is unfortunately hospitalized due to their depression? Do they get any special compensation for that?
Yeah, so if a veteran's hospitalized for 21 days or more, they can get what's called a temporary total ratings or a temporary 100% rating for the time that they are hospitalized until the time that they are discharged. If a veteran's hospitalized, and this is again assuming it's for the depression or the service-connected condition. If they're hospitalized for the depression for at least 6 months, they'll get the temporary total rating for that 6 months of hospitalization, and then for the 6 months following discharge.
Okay. And of course, like any condition out there, a veteran can get TDIU due to depression if it prevents you from working.
Yes.
Okay, so you can either end up with a temporary rating if you're hospitalized, or if you can't work, certainly consider looking into that TDIU rating. Are there common mistakes that VA makes when adjudicating depression claims?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we were talking about previously was, in-service incurrence of depression. So sometimes VA will make the mistake that's saying that, well, no, your depression is due to this other event that happened while in service, but it's not related to your military service. And they're missing the fact that it still happened during military service. They'll also sometimes say that, well, you had depression in service, but it resolved, and now your depression is really due to your post-service life stressors, without considering the fact that it was still, going on. Maybe you just weren't treating for it. So those are very common errors that we see. And then they also try to parse out and say that, oh, it's due to your personality disorder, these symptoms. It's not due to this anxiety that's due to service.
Okay. And anything veterans should remember, Courtney, when claiming depression?
Yeah, I think just kind of thinking back about the things that we talked about in terms of establishing direct service connection. So keeping in mind that you need the diagnosis, so you need the current disability, and you need to be able to point to something in service, whether it is a military event or something that happened to you in service outside of your military experience. And then that medical nexus is going to be really important. You need something tying together your current disability to your time in service, or again to a condition you may already be service connected for that has resulted in your depression.
Okay. Michelle, anything that you think veterans need to be mindful of when claiming depression?
So just because you started out claiming depression and you later get a diagnosis of PTSD doesn't mean that you now are required to file a new claim. VA is supposed to broadly construe your claim for depression to include all psychiatric conditions, because you're not a medical doctor. You don't necessarily know what your medical diagnosis is, but you are competent to talk about the symptoms you're experiencing, and VA is supposed to be aware of that and treat cases as such.
Okay, great. All right, that's pretty much all we have. Hopefully short and sweet information on depression. Once again, Emma Peterson with Courtney Ross and Michelle Latore from Chisholm, and Kilpatrick, and we'll see you next time.